Stay up to date on the latest political news this election season for less. Visit inforum.news/port and get 3 months of unlimited access to our news network for only 99 cents a month. Subscribe now at inforum.news/port. This podcast is brought to you by the North Dakota Petroleum Foundation. From heating our homes and powering our vehicles to cell phones, clothing, and medical equipment, oil and natural gas makes everyday life better. North Dakota Oil and Natural Gas, advancing the possibilities. Learn more at ndpetroleumfoundation.org. Forum Communications Company is proud to be a part of the Trust Project. Learn more at thetrustproject.org. Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy Friday to it for you. And gosh, it was an eventful week from the United States Supreme Court, right? I mean, it seems like all we're talking about is the Supreme Court, and it's abortion, it's prayers, and one of the big ones, though, and this is, I don't want to say that none of these, that the other opinions weren't consequential for North Dakota, because of course they were, hugely so. But this one, maybe even more consequential for North Dakota, not just because we were one of the co-plaintiffs. Our former Attorney General and obviously current Attorney General, though he hasn't been on the job that long, Drew Wrigley, and former Attorney General Wayne Stenjum, absolutely instrumental in fighting this fight, where the Supreme Court told the EPA, you don't have the authority that you've been exercising to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. Now, a lot of the response to that I've been seeing is the Supreme Court, blocks the federal government's ability to regulate carbon. And that's not true. What the Supreme Court said is Congress hasn't given you that authority, right? And that's been such a theme. In fact, I wrote a column about it this morning. That's been such a theme of this Supreme Court. The Supreme Court wasn't saying abortion is illegal. The Supreme Court is saying the Constitution is neutral on the question of abortion. Right. The Supreme Court is not saying, hey, EPA, you can't regulate carbon. The Supreme Court is saying, hey, EPA, if you want to regulate in that fashion, you have to get authority to do so from the lawmakers, from Congress. And I think when some of the dust settles, I think we're going to be happier about this. We're such a divided country, and I think leaning on the courts to sort of make these decisions for us, instead of making policy through the political process, has allowed, both sides to kind of retreat to more extreme positions. What I'm hoping, and maybe this is very Pollyannish of me, but what I'm hoping is that this says, hey, no, you have to find solutions through the political process again. Anyway, all that.
Hey, you know what, though?
This is my guest, Jason Boherer, who's from the Lignite Energy Council, who did not come on for a general political discussion, but instead to talk about how important this ruling is for the coal industry specifically. But go ahead, Jason, jump in.
I was going to say, you don't even have to be Pollyannish to say that. You can say that very cynically, that this is going to force people back to the table, because what you see in politics is both everybody in Congress, for the most part, they're trying to avoid accountability. And the way they avoid accountability is they push power to the executive branch. They push decisions to the executive branch. And so the CO2 question is exactly something that Congress didn't want to deal with effectively. So they punted it to the executive branch. And there's a lot of people who wanted an aggressive CO2 regulation, but they didn't have the votes for it. So they push it to the executive branch, and then there's no consequences, right? There's no consequences when the Clean Power Plan was going to shut down half of the coal plants in North Dakota. Who are you going to yell at in Congress? They just throw up their hands and say, it wasn't us. But now, if they wanted to shut down the power plants, they got to put their name on the bill. You got to vote yes or no. And that's why for a state like North Dakota, this is a great result, because not only is it the specific example of carbon dioxide coming from power plants, but our legislators are the ones who are trying to push accountability. They're trying to push the North Dakota way of doing things as an example into the spotlight. We've got people who want to be accountable for their decisions. So this is a great decision for democracy and a great decision for the power plants. to the extent that I kind of feel guilty saying, hey, this is a great decision for power plants, because it's much broader than that. This is a good decision for democracy.
Yeah, I really think so. Insofar as that it moves a pressing political concern back into the political arena where it should be settled. And you made a really good point where politicians wanted to avoid some of these issues. And I don't want to talk about abortion because that's such a sticky issue, but I mean, that's an example of one. It's such a difficult, complex, emotional issue. Politicians would rather that be settled by courts than by them, because when they have to push the yes or no button on legislation, or they have to go into a committee room and make tough amendments and make tough compromises, they have to go back and explain that to constituents. It's a lot easier to just push it all off onto the courts. And I think it's the exact same thing with this issue, right? Climate change, the climate issue, the environmental issue, and also our need for stable, reliable, affordable power. These things are hard to reconcile with one another, right? We know that we have to be concerned about the environment. We know that emissions are something that we need to be aware of and we need to be constantly improving. But on the other hand, we also, if we want to live the sort of lifestyle we've all become accustomed to, then we also need reliable power. And Jason, we've been bumping up against an ugly part of that balance for a while. When you're hearing the service operators, I call them the grids. I got corrected by an energy expert who says you're calling these things grids and they're not actually grids. I call them grids because I'm a layman. That's why I'm using the term that way. But they're what are they? System operators or whatever.
Yeah, the RTOs and
RTOs. There you go. MISO and the Southwest Power Pool. Those are the two that serve North Dakota. They're being rated as not reliable, right? What I'm trying to think of the term.
They're getting less reliable.
They're getting less reliable, and they're getting ranked up as we have risk of like blackouts, and that. I mean, but for like a storm comes through and knocks over some power lines or something, that wasn't ever something we had to worry about in the past, and now it is.
You bring up a great point, because these RTOs, they need to be governed by policymakers. They don't need to be governed by lawsuits. And yet, when the policies are being made in the courtroom and then they're being passed down ultimately to MISO or SPP, those are not good policy. That's not a good pathway to make good policy, right? And you mentioned Wayne Stenjum. This is like really a capstone of his legacy, because this is what he would talk about all the time, which is empower the states to make the decisions that are best for the states using their expertise. We are the experts in the states on these things. And just that way of pushing policy that wasn't even really tied to any reality, pushing that policy making into the courts and then asking a group like MISO or SPP to implement it, it was bound to fail. And the proof is in the pudding, because our grids have become less stable, less resilient.
Well, you mentioned this being a victory for democracy, and I think that's right. And it's a victory because what democracy is a sort of accountability, right? So if the decisions are being made by policymakers, well, these are people who are elected. Or at least if they're appointed, they're very close to the people. But in North Dakota, like for instance, our Public Service Commission, they're elected, right? They're elected. If you don't like it, you can go talk to Julie Fedorchak. You can go talk to Randy Chrisman. You can recall them from office, I guess, if you think they're doing a really terrible job.
Right.
You can run somebody else against them in the election if you don't like the way they regulate. Our state lawmakers, the same thing. Our governor, the same thing. All of these people who have an impact on our power reliability and our policy in North Dakota, you can't do that with a federal judge, right? You can't go in. In fact, it's very inappropriate to call up a federal judge and say, you better rule this way or we're gonna, I mean, not threatening, but you know what I mean? Like we're not gonna vote for you. You can't vote for them, right? You're not supposed to try to influence them, but yet for some reason we have judges in courtrooms. And it was so funny. Like I was the other day, I was thinking about like pipelines and transmission lines and all these things, and how much of the policy around them is just being set in like some courtroom where it's like, well, now they got to go back to the judge and make sure that this plan is okay. And it's like, why is the judge doing this? We didn't appoint him to be the regulator of pipelines, right? I understand like that's if you file a lawsuit because you think the law is being broken, he should apply the law. But it's like the judges are acting like regulators and the judges aren't regulators. And I feel like that's what the Supreme Court was saying. Congress and the executive branch, you're the policymakers. You make the policy, not us.
Yeah, and that's where it gets a little, I think you can see the disingenuousness from some of the environmental industrial groups coming through right now, because back in the day, and President Obama was the first one who really hit this, like, hey, elections have consequences, when Republicans were objecting to Obamacare and all this. And it was like a big deal. Elections have consequences, right? This makes elections have greater consequences.
Right.
So that's good. That allows the people to have more input. And the other thing you throw this around on social media or whatnot, like 90% of the people or whatever, some huge percentage allegedly supports carbon dioxide regulation. Well, great. That ought to make it really easy to elect people to implement reasonable CO2 regulations. And I think that's ultimately what we're going to get, is reasonable CO2 regulation, because I agree, more than half the people in the country are raising their hand saying we need to do something.
Yeah.
But that is a range that goes from we need to do a little bit to we need to do a lot. And that's the democratic process.
Right. And so that means that if Congress wants to enact that and give some new authority to the EPA to regulate emissions in some way, then they're going to have to go through the process. And it's not just going to be Senator Elizabeth Warren and Ron Wyden from Oregon. It's going to have to also include John Hoeven and Kevin Cramer from North Dakota, and Joe Manchin from West Virginia, and Kristen Sinema from Arizona, and Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. You're going to have, and that's the way it's supposed to work, is we're going to make a policy, but it's got to be answerable to everybody, because coal miners matter too, and manufacturing customers who use an enormous amount of power, they matter too. All of these things have to matter, and in the legal process, a lot of times they don't. So let's get specific. I think we've been talking about very sort of broad implications, specifically for North Dakota. What does this mean?
I think it actually increases the odds that you're going to see carbon capture technology on a greater number of our power plants, because it increases the flexibility with which we can attack this issue. We had the greatest issue with the Clean Power Plan was the timeline. The EPA was demanding that we implement these drastic reductions in CO2 emissions in a timeline that was impossible to meet without shutting them down. So our utilities in North Dakota are all looking at, how do you solve CO2 issues? How do you solve CO2 emissions? Now, they're not going to be feeling like we have to do that in the next 5 years, or the EPA is going to crack down on us. So it allows them to say, here's a power plant that I know I can capture whatever, pick a number, 80% of the CO2, despite the fact that wouldn't have been enough under the Clean Power Plan, but it's going to be enough under this flexibility regime that perhaps will be permitted. So I think that's the good news, is it increases the odds that we can have good policy in North Dakota that keep the power plants operating and the environment clean.
See, I think that's really counterintuitive to what sort of maybe the narrative that we're hearing from people who are upset about this Supreme Court decision, West Virginia versus EPA, or I guess we could say North Dakota versus EPA, because we were a co-plaintiff on that. But the narrative they're saying is, well, we're going to give the coal industry more flexibility, so they're going to slow everything down, right? So they're going to be less likely to want to go out and capture because they don't have the EPA bearing down on them, forcing them to do this. That's their perspective. So address that.
Yeah. So I think it's demonstrably false. It was in our comments to the EPA that is, we want to capture CO2. We want to do it. But the timeline from the EPA wasn't even agreeing with the timeline of Obama's own Department of Energy. So that's how far out of sync the EPA was with reality. is they didn't even talk to the experts in Obama's own administration. They just said, we're going to do it this fast. And so that's why I would say, hold up. We're still going to get the capture of CO2. We're just going to get it on a slightly different timeline. But again, irony of ironies, if the Clean Power Plan would not have been stayed, do you think that Coal Creek would have been purchased? Do you think that they would be looking to implement carbon capture technology? So the flexibility that is now inherent in this approach is going to pay dividends for North Dakota's power plants, because they're going to do what the EPA said that they wanted them to do, but they're going to do it in ways that is more technologically advanced, and in a timeline that is more appropriate. But at the end of the day, we're going to get clean power. And I think that's what the EPA said they wanted.
Well, the thing is that that's what they said they wanted. And this is now
Right.
that this is me reading between the political, well, maybe not reading so much through the lines, because at times certain political leaders have just flat out said it. But it always felt like the timeline was obviously just, we're going to make it so they can't possibly comply. Like ostensibly, we're out here to try to improve coal and move towards cleaner
Right.
power and everything. But really, we're going to make them do it on a timeline that they can't possibly meet, because the real goal is to bankrupt them so we can move on to reliables. Yeah. And it just how foolish that was, because you were talking like Coal Creek, for instance. Like what if the Clean Power Plan hadn't been stayed and Coal Creek closes? Not only is that sad for a lot of coal miners and a lot of power operators and a lot of communities in central North Dakota, which would have dried up and died, but that's terrible for our regional grid reliability, right? Like they're already saying meso, for example, Coal Creek is on the meso system. Yep. So meso's already like ranked as having significant reliability problems, and now you take North Dakota's largest coal-fired power plant off that grid. I'm using grid again. My reader is going to be all up. Everybody knows what I'm talking about. You take that off that system, and now we're in deeper trouble, right? We got major reliability issues.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the other issues that we raised in our comments with the EPA is you still have to balance these issues. And the balancing act that EPA originally set forth in this Clean Power Plan was not balanced very well, because it overestimated the amount of technological advancement that could be brought to bear on the CO2 issue, and it underestimated the amount of damage that taking these power plants out of the equation, would cause. And so, I think that for the most part, the policies have been set with maybe laudable goals, but then they're implemented by flawed human beings who can be motivated by a lot of different things. And some of them are clearly motivated by a hatred for the fossil fuel industry.
I think they've just convinced themselves that we don't need coal anymore, and they're wrong.
Yeah, and I think that they're getting advice from very flawed people who are making that argument. But shouldn't it, so those folks are going to they're going to be replaced in the decision-making process by legislators who you could go talk to. I don't know who it is in the EPA who wrote that Clean Power Plan, but I can go talk to, whether it's Kevin Kramer, Joe Manchin, all these people who would be involved in writing a replacement. That's a step in the right direction for transparency. Even if that were the only justification, that would be sufficient.
Yeah. I like that. I like that, because people who aren't from coal country are going to have to make a compromise with people who are, and that's how it should work.
Right.
You think this is a big deal? Like I think we have all these carbon capture projects in North Dakota. We have, and even, some of them not even the hydrogen, Bakken Energy, the hydrogen people who bought the bought the Dakota gasification plant. There's already a carbon pipeline. They're going to have access to that. Yep. They're trying to build a new carbon pipeline, Coal Creek with carbon capture. I mean, it's everywhere right now. And you think this ruling, because it takes some of the heat off, it makes a lot of those projects more viable?
It does, because just as an example, if you were going to invest in a power plant and put on $1 billion of CO2 capture infrastructure, and your objective was to capture that and then sequester it, and then ultimately maybe 15 years from now start selling it in the oil field. If you thought that you were going to recoup that $1 billion investment over the next 15 years, that you'll make that purchase. But if you worry that the EPA is going to shut you down after 3 years because of an arbitrary decision on CO2, then that wealth just never comes into our economy. Our GDP never increases. That wealth just goes somewhere else, and it never helps our state.
One of the arguments that I always hear about carbon capture is that it's this pie in the sky thing. It's never worked before. They're just throwing a lot of bad money after it. And when you get down to like the white papers, right? Because you have some of the like think tanks or activist groups or whatever, and they issue these white papers. And if you actually read them, right, like not just the headlines that they produce, but you go through and you read them, a lot of them were really based on the timeline that we were talking about. Like the reason carbon capture wasn't going to work out, it was because the EPA was setting this ridiculous timeline for it to work, or maybe unreasonable timeline for it to work on, right? It's like it's not going to work because the government has set the table for it to fail. And I feel like maybe that's what we've done is we said, no, we're not going to force it to fail. We're actually going to try it. And who knows? I mean, there's risk in anything. I don't want to say anything's a sure thing, especially with how fast technology and everything's moving these days. But gosh, it sure looks like a better bet now than it did a week ago.
The technology is pretty sound. And I think it's been around long enough. We know how to use a means to capture CO2.
It's just scaling, right? I mean, isn't it just scaling at this point?
It's scaling and finances, because, it is a big project. And quite frankly, that's one of the biggest obstacles that it needs to overcome is just the scaling problem. And I think that we can do that in North Dakota. That's actually what we're testing. We believe in it sufficiently enough that we're investing in that technology from our state Clean Sustainable Energy Authority, from our Lignite Research Council, because we do believe it's scalable. And then you're going to see, okay, that scales as we thought it would scale. Now you can start implementing it around the world. And why is that a bad thing? We're trying to reduce CO2 emissions worldwide. And here's another option to do so. I think that these folks who advocate against it, as they will refer to it as pie in the sky or whatever, and like you say, I think they are willfully ignorant or they're being disingenuous.
I don't know. I mean, we have so much coal in this country. If we could continue to use it in a way that's in line with modern understandings about climate science, why wouldn't we strive for that goal to keep this abundant and cheap energy resource alive? I don't. That's never made a lot of sense to me. And also, speaking of it being a global problem, I mean, America's doing pretty good. I mean, we're doing pretty excellent when it comes to reducing carbon when you compare to some of the other places in the world. And every time we regulate coal out of, we shut down another coal plant here, another one opens like in China, where they care a lot less about these things than we do. So anyway, that's a whole other topic for a whole other show. Right. Let's talk about capital for a minute. You said one of the big problems is finding the people willing to invest in this stuff. And a lot of that's political too, right? That's a lot of people who are out there pressuring boards of directors and investment groups and everything else and telling them you got to divest from fossil fuels. You got to divest from oil. You got to divest from coal. You got to divest from even natural gas. And so do you think this changes that at all?
I think it does a little bit. Because I do think there was that element of uncertainty, which is you need to divest from fossil fuel because the EPA is going to shut you down. It's no longer a wise financial investment, is what some of the arguments were. But now you're able to say with more certainty, if we put $1 billion into this, the EPA isn't going to arbitrarily shut us down. We're gonna kind of go back to the democratic process where policy is made in an open, transparent manner, and there's not this whiplash from the judiciary or from the administrative branch that causes these sharp hairpin turns in policy. So that means that if you're a board, you should feel better about authorizing a large capital project for carbon capture.
Because the political process, and this is going to sound weird to say this, but it really is. The legislative process is a lot more predictable. I mean, think about it this way. Like look at the swing in policy. However you feel, and I got a diverse listening audience. So however you felt about Donald Trump or Joe Biden, there's no denying there is a massive swing in terms of their philosophies on things like oil and coal and pipelines and all that stuff. Very, very different philosophy. So from election to election, you have this massive swing. You don't necessarily have that when Congress has to act. And also look at the way where we're all wringing our hands and refreshing the Supreme Court website or our favorite news website, waiting to find out what the latest pronouncement from the black robes are. That's such brinksmanship there, right? It is unpredictable. I mean, even like, we have a conservative court. You still don't know how they're going to rule. You don't know. Nobody knows, right? Because and this isn't me criticizing the court. They do things the way they do it for a lot of excellent reasons. It's just they shouldn't be as involved as they are.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, if your listeners, if anybody's ever sat there and been frustrated with an executive with a rulemaking, if you ever thought that Obama went too far, if you thought that Trump went too far and abused his authority, if you thought that Biden did, this is a good decision for you, regardless of your politics. Because you know what? Presidents, and I don't care what president it is, don't like this decision because it constrains the power of the executive branch, and they don't like their power constrained. This is more in line with a weak executive that the founding fathers envisioned, who would execute the laws. They didn't want rival rulemaking bodies, the legislative rulemaking body and the executive rulemaking body. Right now, we have two rival rulemaking and legislative bodies, and that is not okay.
No, and let's be honest. A lot of people in Congress enabled this because, as we were talking about at the beginning of the show, it's a lot less politically risky if you could just talk about the issues without ever having to do it. You could say, I'm going to talk about this issue, but, it's the courts that are really deciding it. That's, if you hear politics, that's them punting their responsibility. And maybe those sorts of people don't need to be in Congress. Anyway, again, that's a whole other show. Jason, any final thoughts before I let you go?
I think for those of us in North Dakota who love the fact that we have the cleanest air in the country, that is going to continue. We're also going to be able to have a more robust energy, ag, industrial sector in this state because there's less uncertainty that is going to be coming down from the executive branch. Again, this is a big deal for the energy industry in North Dakota, but it's a bigger deal for the country.
Well, if we could paraphrase our current president, it is a big flippin' deal. I'm not going to say going to say everything he said, but it is. It's a really big deal. Jason, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.